In this guide, we're going to be taking a look at all the different enemy types and bosses in Resident Evil Village. A few years after surviving the crazy Baker family back in Louisiana, Ethan Winters is once again flung back into another, even wackier nightmare scenario, winding up in a monster-infested Eastern European village in search for his missing baby daughter Rose. When he's not too busy supergluing his hands back on and looking out for boxes covered in yellow paint, he's battling all sorts of malevolent mold-based beasts, from ghoulish maidens to cyberpunk drill people, to this god-awful thing, along with half the cast of the bloody Twilight saga. Whatever horror tropes didn't fit into the last game, they're sure as hell gonna be squished into this one. In Resident Evil Village, we're not taking on legions of undead zombies, or dealing with mouldy blob men with piranha faces, as we've been plopped into a region that's absolutely swarming with ugly hairy blokes instead, all of which want to tear us limb from limb and turn us into steak tartare. These guys are known as the Lycans, very violent, feral creatures which serve as one of the game's most common enemy types. Basically part human, part beast hybrids, originating from experiments conducted on the poor people of the village. Many of the locals have now become infected, due to either getting bitten by other Lycans, or due to them being homegrown lab rats themselves. And they're not exactly going to give you a very warm welcome to their bestial society, typically grouping up together to overwhelm any human they come across. Being armed with a variety of different makeshift weapons, while having some enhanced animalistic abilities, gives them a distinct advantage over an unarmed human, with boosted strength, agility, and durability, all being pretty good traits for combat and hunting down prey. None of this makes our lives any easier, as they're ducking and dodging our bullets while constantly doing the cha-cha slide, but a few well-placed shots to the noggin should still be enough to convince them to have a long lie down nevertheless. Never fails. Unless, of course, you're up against one of these tanky bastards. Some of the Lycans are clever enough to know that being blasted in the face by a spread of buckshot is likely gonna sting a bit. So to try and avoid that reality, they've gone and got themselves a bunch of random metal objects and crafted some heavy-duty armour. Not only to give them extra protection, but also to give them something else to hack you to death with too, now being armed with a pair of massive spiky claws. So you definitely might want to put some stronger ammunition to one side, just in case one of these guys decides to show up to give you a good jabbing. It's going to take more firepower to bring him down, but if you do notice that mask falling off, you know exactly what to do next. Time to delete that head. When I said that we weren't going to be taking on any zombies this time, I guess that statement wasn't entirely true. If you go down into the castle dungeons, you're going to see all sorts of nasty medieval stuff down there. And as it turns out, that's also where our next monster originates from. The Moroaica is basically an undead mutant woman, drained of blood and infected with the region's infamous mold, only to be brought back to life to serve as a zombified guardian for the castle and its grounds. So yeah, these things are quite literally zombies, technically even more so than the ones riddled with the T-virus over in Raccoon City. But let's not get into that debate. Most of these women would have been maids in enslaved villages, punished to suffer a fate worse than death, now reduced to a soulless, mindless creature that creeps around in the darkness with a face like a demented goblin bat. They look like their Monday morning alarm's just gone off and they're now on a mission to drag themselves to the coffee machine in the kitchen. And much like most normal people on a Monday morning, apart from the annoyingly sprightly ones, these things certainly aren't to be messed around with. Hence why they're carrying around half of the castle's friggin' armory. Shoot them in the leg to stagger them, shoot them in the arm to disarm them, and shoot them in the face to put them out of their misery. Which would be a hell of a lot easier to do if they weren't constantly stumbling around the place like they've chugged down a whole bottle of Smirnoff. Resident Evil Village has got a lot of gothic horror vampire themes going on, so it seemed like a bit of an oversight to not throw some sort of messed up bat monster into the mix here too. The Samca is another mold-infected woman originally enslaved in the castle. But unlike the Moroaica, these things have undergone some pretty extreme mutations, extending and morphing their arms into a pair of fleshy wings, while developing their tongue into a long spiky blood-sucking proboscis, radically changing their anatomy and sort of turning them into giant human mosquitoes. So aside from having to deal with a bunch of undead freaks on the ground, you've also got to pay attention to them flapping around above your head as well. They might flitter about the place in a bit of an awkward way, but thankfully it's not going to take too many bullets to bring them crashing back down to ground level. Though if you'd rather save yourself some of the hassle, then you might be best waiting for them to land on one of their perches, only to snipe them over distance with a well-placed rifle shot. Their eyesight's pretty crap, but their sense of hearing isn't, kinda like a bat. So just be aware that as soon as you let that gun ring out, don't be too surprised if the rest of the flock comes swooping over to give you a good kicking. Might be best switching over to the good old boomstick in this case, and ready yourself up for a bit of vampiric skeet shooting. After arriving at Castle Dimitrescu, it won't be long until you realise that the place isn't quite as empty as it seems, being the home of a freakishly tall aristocratic woman and her 3 so-called daughters. They might look a bit like humans on the face of it, but they're actually all heavily mutated experiments, and that nasty mold from the last game is once again the culprit here too. Resident Evil Biohazard demonstrated just how the mold can cause some pretty wacky mutations by fusing with DNA to imitate life forms such as bugs. 3 of the castle maids were experimented on, spawning mold imitations of blowflies, which basically devoured the girls' dead bodies and allowed the blowflies to mimic their human forms. No longer having any memory of their past lives, but still retaining the same sort of levels of intelligence as before. The 3 mutant girls were adopted by the lady of the castle, Alcina Dimitrescu, and they all lived happily ever after, munching on the flesh of their unfortunate servants. Well, up until you show up to throw a spanner in the works, that is. Oh no, we're being chased around by a bunch of attractive goth girls. What a terrible situation to be in. I suppose it is sort of terrible when you take into the fact that we're actually being catfished by swarms of flesh-eating flies, which can switch forms whenever the hell they feel like it. And because these flies need a constant supply of human blood to actually function, it makes pretty good sense to avoid them at all costs. Otherwise, you might end up like this poor dude. Shooting the daughters in their human form causes them to dissipate into clouds of bugs, temporarily slowing their movements. But otherwise, they're practically invincible to your attacks. And because the 3 girls have picked up the same sadistic traits as their bloodthirsty mother, they'd much rather chase you around the castle and have a bit of fun watching you try your best to run away. This is a pretty good example of why you probably shouldn't play with your food. And you'll eventually come to realise that the cold air causes the mold in their bodies to go into a state of cryobiosis, weakening the daughters, thus preventing them from transforming into those blurry clouds of pests. You've basically got to find ways to expose them to that fresh mountainous air from outside the castle walls, and whenever you get the opportunity to lower the temperature, you can go crazy with those guns while the daughters are in that vulnerable state, eventually causing them to calcify, thus putting a stop to them constantly harassing you while you're trying to get shit done. Now, just to add a bit of context for the next bit, which will probably iron a few things out regarding the story, the entire region in Resident Evil Village is basically divided up by 4 different lords, all belonging to noble families, and now all part of a pretty bizarre cult, overseen by a mysterious woman called Mother Miranda. She's basically the big menace to society up at the top of the food chain, pulling all the strings and generally being the sole reason why the place is in such a messed up state, swamped by monsters wreaking havoc on the village. Not very good for TripAdvisor, but also not very good for the locals either, who've all essentially been brainwashed by her to follow a neo-pagan religion, which is basically a made-up pile of bollocks, simply there to disguise Miranda's sinister motives, giving her freedom to control the area and conduct experiments on the villagers using the mold. She managed to create a wacky-looking parasite called the Cadou, which looks like some sort of weird mutant fetus thing, or the Resident Evil equivalent of those jelly egg aliens from the late 1990s. And this was then implanted into her test subjects, resulting in the monsters that we see in the game. We'll talk a lot more about Miranda later on in the video, but it's key to know that she also used this mold parasite on the 4 lords too, giving them unique mutations and powers which help to play into a manipulative master plan. One of the 4 lords of the village is Alcina Dimitrescu, that massive woman with the big hat who spots you snooping around the castle. Despite living a somewhat normal life in the past, Mother Miranda's Cadou experiments caused Alcina to rapidly mutate, making her freakishly tall, giving her superhuman strength, and basically stunting her aging process dead in its tracks. By the time we get to meet her in the game, she's well over 100 years old. Alcina was born with a hereditary blood disease, though the mutation didn't quite get rid of it. If anything, it actually complicated things even further and forced her into cannibalism, becoming dependent on human flesh and blood to maintain a healthy body, hence all the vampire stuff. Much like Alcina's adopted mutant daughters, she'll be chasing you around the castle too, and the more mischief you get up to in there, then the more pissed off she's gonna get. Especially when you start turning her daughters into crusty piles of dandruff. She might be ordered to capture you alive, but it doesn't take too long before Lady Dimitrescu flips a switch and goes on a bit of a revenge mission instead, giving her a nice excuse to flex her powers and show off those retractable Wolverine fingernails. Of course, this is going to be her weapon of choice, so no death by snoo-snoo. And because bullets don't seem to do jack shit against her, the only thing you can really do is just run away and do your best to navigate around the place without getting your head sliced off. Good job she can't be bothered to run anywhere. Eventually, you'll gain access to the family crypt, where someone's fortunately left a toxic monster-killing dagger for us to play around with. Problem is, she knows exactly what we're up to, and sneaks up on us before we can come up with much of a plan. But before we get fingernailed to death and suffocated by those massive knockers, we do manage to get a sneaky jab in with that knife, seriously wounding the big woman and causing her to yeet us out of a nearby window. As the poison quickly starts to circulate in her bloodstream, well, this has a pretty wild reaction and forces her to radically mutate out of control, in typical Resident Evil fashion, transforming her into a gigantic dragon thing with fleshy wings and a ridiculously spiky mouth, with the only remains of her previous form being a twisted humanoid blob poking out of the monster's back. Now we can finally take Dimitrescu on in a fair fight on the castle rooftops. And by fair, I mean the fact that she can actually be hurt now, not the fact that she's a giant friggin' dragon. You'll have to survive a barrage of slamming attacks and avoid being squished to death as she stomps around in the very limited space that you've got up there, just casually knocking down walls and smashing her castle to pieces. And the fact that she can now fly also complicates the situation even more so, conducting swooping aerial strikes to try and knock you down to the ground below. But because she's so bloody slow to rely solely on brute force, Alcina's also going to rely on summoning an entire Plagues of Egypt style swarm of deadly flies, which are all going to come buzzing over, forcing you to seek refuge in one of the nearby turrets, because apparently flies don't like turrets. Whenever you get the opportunity, you'll want to take shots at Alcina's weak spot, the wiggly humanoid thing with all the writhing tentacles sprouting out from it, pumping it with buckshot up close, and smacking it around with sniper rifle bullets from afar. Which eventually takes us to the final part of the fight, where Dimitrescu smashes into the side of the castle wall and forces us up the stairs, to reach an even smaller area to commence battle. Here you've just got to keep shooting the wiggly back woman while trying not to get sucker punched by a wall of teeth, all while she's just casually destroying her own castle. And after dealing enough damage, the floor's going to give way, and you'll both go crashing down to the bottom of the tower. One nasty monster lord down, another 3 nasty monster lords to go. Well, it's time to talk about the elephant in the room, and by elephant, I mean that gloriously horrible f***ed up mutant baby. If you haven't got the foggiest idea what I'm talking about here, and you've somehow managed to avoid seeing it plastered all over the internet, then prepare yourself for one of the most twisted monsters to come out of a Capcom dev's imagination. Up to the point of reaching Donna Beneviento's house, it's not exactly been too much of a wild ride regarding the scary stuff, at least compared to the horror show that was Resident Evil 7. But that creepy house on the hill is where things start to take a bit of a shift, and if even Winters hasn't already had enough horror tropes shoved in his face over the past couple of outings, then he better be prepared for what's to follow. We've got haunted mansions, spooky dolls, dismembered mannequins, and of course, demonic babies from the bowels of hell. Should you be brave enough to go down into the basement, which you kinda have to be to continue the story, then it won't be too long until you meet a new friend down there. A massive deformed fetus thing that looks like it's crawled its way out of Pennywise's arse. This thing's eager to turn us into a gobstopper, and it'll relentlessly hunt us down while we're navigating around the claustrophobic darkness. Doesn't help being so cramped down there, and very easy to get cornered by the monster, which will inevitably lead to us getting eaten alive, having no weapons to try and hold it back. Because we don't really want that to happen, we've got to be smart about how to avoid the bloody thing, leading it around obstacles and hiding under the furniture, crossing our fingers that it can't see our legs poking out of the side. But once we've outsmarted the big nasty Silent Hill baby by reaching the elevator, we can just about get away by the skin of our teeth. 2 questions might spring to mind here though. Why the hell is there a freaky baby monster down in the basement? And how the hell did it manage to get down there in the first place? Well, things should make a little bit more sense as we introduce the next lord of the region, Donna Beneviento. So the village is split up between 4 lords, and one of those lords is a psychologically troubled doll maker called Donna Beneviento, who probably seems like a bit of an unlikely character to have any sort of political power in the region. She typically isolates herself in a spooky mansion on the outskirts of the village, surrounded by an army of toy dolls to essentially replace her own deceased family. And the creepiest doll of the bunch just so happens to be Donna's favourite, a puppet called Angie, which was given as a present from her father. What a thoughtful thing to give a child. Well, any normal kid would probably have nightmares for years if this thing popped up under the Christmas tree, but Donna's not exactly a very normal person, cherishing the doll and having a very strong bond to it, possibly using Angie as a comfort object to help deal with her lifelong mental problems. But because Donna's also a victim to Mother Miranda's Cadou experiments, essentially making her a mutant, she's somehow gained the ability to manipulate the minds of other people who've come into contact with spores released by mold-infested plants growing all around the house and garden. Donna was kind enough to share her Cadou parasite with the creepy toy doll Angie, and this allowed her to express a bit of a crazy sadistic alter ego through the doll by controlling its actions, acting as a substitute to her true self. As you make your way around the house, it won't be long until Donna starts to torment Ethan with those mind-bending powers. That hallucinogenic pollen causes you to trip balls and encounter nightmarish things. Hence why there's a big scary baby wobbling around in the basement, playing into Ethan's current psychological issues regards to his missing baby daughter Rose. It turns out that along with Angie, the other dolls in Donna's collection also share a piece of her Parasite too. Not very good news for us, as this makes them all do the Harlem Shake while Donna tries to gain control of them over distance. Though as soon as you find Angie, you can give that creepy thing a stab in the head with an old rusty pair of scissors. Not quite enough to end the nightmare just yet, but at least we're heading in the right direction. We've basically got to keep playing a game of hide and seek, trying not to take too long to avoid being butchered by Donna's gang of mind-controlled death toys. But thankfully, Angie does a pretty crappy job at actually hiding, just lying around in the open leaving trails of blood everywhere. And after we've dealt with her a few times, stabbing that creepy face with a pair of scissors, we'll come to the sudden realization that we've actually been chasing Donna around the house and stabbing her in the face with those scissors instead. Our warped perception of reality made Donna invisible the whole time, and her death finally put a stop to all the hallucinations and destructive illusions. Move over, Lycans, cause there's an even bigger, badder wolf on the prowl. Just like the other hairy nasties roaming around the village, the Varcolac is yet another experimental accident. These things were created by injecting wolf blood into the spine of a Cadou infected human, so a Lycan. Then this basically spliced and mutated its genes, with this freaky monstrosity being the end result. Because of their mixed DNA, I guess you could say these things are much more in line with being actual werewolves. They might have the most luscious hair in all the land, but they're also one of the deadliest creatures you can come across too. Having immense speed, power and durability, and generally being something that could bite you in half if you give it the chance. All that said, the Varcolac's biggest weakness? Rickety wooden huts. Apparently these things are too bloody huge to fit through those big ass doorways and massive wall gaps, and just so long as you're inside some old shack, or someone's garden shed, then the big fluffy bastard can't get to you. It's still going to try and reach you from outside the door, like it's trying to grab the last Pringle in the tube. But so long as you're out of arm's length, you'll be able to blast the thing away with gunfire, completely safe from being torn to shreds. Varcolacs aren't just going to stand there waiting for you to blast their heads off though, as they will run away to try and lure you back outside into the danger zone. But using heavy weapons and explosive mines should be enough to make short work of them. There is one Varcolac that's smarter than the others though, with that being the Alpha, a beefier red-eyed variant found wandering around outside the mansion on the hill. This guy's pretty similar to the others, but it's also going to use the tall grass to try and conceal its position. Plus it's not going to hang around outside the doorways, waiting to be shot in the face, forcing you to pull up those socks and take it down head on where you're going to be at your most vulnerable. Another member of the cult is Salvatore Moreau, the third lord of the village who typically likes to hang around an abandoned reservoir. Now compared to the other lords, this guy is definitely the biggest outcast, and he's also the most compliant to Mother Miranda's zany religion, despite the fact that she turned him into a fugly fish mutant. Moreau is yet another one of her failed Cadou test subjects, much like the others, and this guy's probably been given the shittiest mutations of the bunch, warping his body, changing his organs, and allowing him to puke out nasty streams of bright green mucus. But the wildest side effect of them all is the fact that he's now prone to randomly transforming into a giant deformed aquatic thing, covered in eyes that look like frog spawn. A pretty extreme mutation that's completely outside of his control. Good thing he lives near a big pool of water. Though despite being a bit of a buffoon, we can't deny that he's still one of the most dangerous monsters in the whole village, which you'll come to realise when you meet him over at the reservoir. He knows Miranda wants you dead, and being such a loyal servant, he's very determined to make that happen to gain some respect. And after puking his guts out and transforming into the monster, you're basically left to try and navigate around the area and find a way to open the lock gates to drain the water from the lake. That's certainly easier said than done, as running around the decrepit remains of a fishing village while being chased by a big dive-bombing flesh submarine with a bazillion teeth is probably about as dangerous as it sounds, forcing you to think very carefully about your movements and try your best not to end up down the monster's gullet. Restoring power and activating the gates will basically leave Moreau feeling a little bit awkward, literally like a fish out of water, having to slope away on those funny looking frog legs, no longer having the reservoir to use as his hunting grounds. But you will catch up with the big fish after making your way through all the debris, where he'll pop out to try and take you on amongst the sunken village. He'll be stomping around the place, trying to flush you out with toxic fumes and streams of corrosive gunk, forcing you to keep your distance and take shots at his human form whenever you get a good opportunity. The problem is that human form's hidden away in the creature's mouth, something you don't really want to be close to. So you've got to convince Moreau to reveal himself using explosives, and as soon as he does, go nuts with your guns while he's briefly exposed. Whenever you notice him go red with rage and attempt to climb up to the nearby vantage point, then it's time to get the hell out of there and find some shelter. He's about to turn into a toxic fountain and shower the place with acid rain covering the entire area. You also want to keep in mind that if he puffs up like a big balloon and starts waddling over in your direction, just put the bloody gun down and start running the opposite way. Might take a bit of time and ammo to finally put Fish Face to sleep, but enough damage will cause Moreau to casually blow up, thus opening up the path to continue on with your journey. 3 lords down, 1 to go. The head honcho of the Lycans and the former chief of the village before everything turned to shit, Urias is basically a hulking mass of fur and muscle, and one of the only monsters strong enough to wield his absolute beast of a weapon. You'll see this guy a few times over the course of the game, towering over his Lycan buddies and basically showing them all who's boss. But of course, you'll eventually be forced to fight him too, otherwise what's the point of him bloody being there? And because his Cadou Parasite has granted him superhuman abilities, you can expect him to be a pretty brutal opponent. Being a brute-styled enemy, what Urias lacks in speed, he makes up for with raw power, as he slowly paces around trying to knock you into another dimension with that oversized hammer. But don't be fooled by his somewhat dozy nature. He might be a fairly slow walker, but he's a surprisingly good jumper, and obviously being such a hefty dude, you don't really want him to land on top of your head. Getting smacked in the face by a stupidly big hammer is one thing, but getting smacked in the face by a flying stone pillar is likely to be another. It's probably no surprise that this guy takes an absolute shed load of damage to bring down, so you might want to use some explosives and heavy ammunition to make life a little bit easier for yourself. But aside from the big hairy bloke, there's also a couple of axe-wielding variants you can find too, that sort of act like optional mini-bosses, which guard some of the game's most valuable treasure. These guys are known as Urias Drac, which basically means devil giants in Romanian. And they're basically very similar enemies to the last guy, aside from having different weapons and not having all that wavy fur. One can be found in Otto's mill, the other can be found wandering around the tombstone on the way to House Beneviento, and you can expect them to both eat quite heavily into your ammo reserves. So if you've only got 5 pistol rounds and a flashbang, then prepare for a bit of a struggle. On the outskirts of the village lies one of the most sinister locations in the region, an old industrial coal mine transformed into an underground weapons research facility, all overseen by a pretty eccentric guy called Karl Heisenberg, the 4th lord of the village. Well, much like the other evil villains in this game, this guy's also prone to conducting a bunch of experiments of his own, only he much prefers to use mechanical parts and high-tech modifications to command the undead, and slap them in the face with VR headsets. The Hauler is pretty much the lower echelon regards to Heisenberg's minions, a reanimated mold-infected male corpse with cybernetic headgear installed, to stabilise neural activity and to make it slightly less stupid. Haulers aren't exactly brilliant fighters, but I guess they're still pretty handy things to have shuffling around the place, to do a bit of extra manual work, and to act as basic guards towards unwelcome intruders. Shouldn't take too much effort to bring them down though, with them acting in a very similar way to the Moroaica, stumbling around like mindless zombies, only really being a danger if you let yourself get surrounded and stuck in a corner with them. So it turns out that Karl Heisenberg's underground facility is actually a massive fully functioning factory. But what is this factory manufacturing? Well, an army of cyborg henchmen of course. What else? The Haulers might be fine enough to act as guards and general cannon fodder, but Heisenberg managed to create a much deadlier, more proficient killing machine by replacing a dead guy's heart with a Cadou Parasite, strapping him up to a bunch of cybernetic components, and replacing his arm with a massive friggin' drill. This guy will be known as the Soldat, a successful candidate to form the basis of Heisenberg's entire mechanized militia, with this standard model, the Soldat Eins, being mass-produced and ready to act as a frontline troop. He stopped making How It's Made episodes back in 2019, so I guess we'll never really know how he managed to pull off such a large-scale venture on his own. But because there's just so many of these Soldats scattered around in the factory, it's no surprise that we're going to run into a fair few of them while we're down there. The Soldat Eins is fairly slow, but still very capable of ripping you a new one by punching you to death with that drill. Because they're essentially walking corpses run by machines, they can't technically be killed. Not in a conventional sense anyway. You've got to treat them like Iron Man by aiming for that power core on their chest, giving you a nice big glowing target to point your gun at, eventually taking them out when it's fully destroyed. But Heisenberg's not just going to stop innovating there, as he's also developed a few other variants too, with his next iteration of biomechanical engineering coming in the form of the Soldat Zwei. Basically the same sort of undead drill dude, but one that brings double the danger. Being another Soldat model, you can expect these guys to have the same sort of characteristics, something that slowly marches around the place looking for someone to bludgeon. But having 2 drill arms to plunge into your chest cavity makes the Soldat Zwei an even bigger thing to worry about, especially when you realise that the big red weak spot on his front has suddenly decided to go AWOL. Oh no. No need to panic though, because it's just been repositioned to his back, which is a bit of an inconvenience, as it's going to be a fair bit harder to actually hit now. But thankfully, shooting the electric wall panels will zap the Soldat and temporarily grind its movements to a halt, allowing you to sneak around to the back and give that reactor a good blasting with your firearms. There's no electric panels nearby, explosives should do the trick fine enough too. The Soldats have ran out of arms to shove drills on, so why not stick a big metal hammerhead shark jetpack on its face too? Frickin' sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their frickin' heads. Heisenberg's definitely thinking a bit more outside the box with this next design, as his much more advanced Soldat jet model has also been unleashed to try and give us a bit of a rough time too. These elite units have been further modified to feature some very swanky gadgets, having jetpacks for better traversal, allowing them to cut you off easier should you try and run away. I don't really blame you for trying to run away from these guys, as they're extremely aggressive and can even line up their drills with a bright red beam of doom. Probably a good thing these guys are pretty rare, as they're more than capable of causing some very big problems. Speaking of causing some very big problems, our last Soldat variant comes in the form of the Panzer, and it's no surprise why Heisenberg's gone and called it that. These things are practically walking tanks, and they look like they've gone and joined the Brotherhood of Steel. Because they're completely covered in armour plating, impenetrable to standard firearms, blasting these things with bullets is sort of like trying to shoot through a brick wall with a super soaker. The Panzers are even slower than usual, weighed down by all those heavy slabs of metal, though despite taking absolutely ages to get anywhere, if they do manage to catch up with you, then prepare to get hit by some of the gnarliest drills in the entire factory. Explosives are going to be your best friend here, and lobbing a pipe bomb, shooting a frag round, or letting them blindly wander over a nearby mine should be enough to strip away some of that suit to reveal that ever so glorious weak spot on their chest. Blasting off their armour will make it a fair bit faster, but at least they're not going to be invincible anymore. Might not be the deadliest monster in the Resident Evil universe, but you can't deny that these things look pretty badass. Easily the most chaotic thing you'll run into in Heisenberg's factory, or in this case try your best not to run into, is a prototype model of the Soldat called Sturm, having a massive turboprop engine plopped on his head with a chainsaw propeller attached to the front. And the only thing he can really do is dash around the place and leave a big pile of destruction in his wake. A pretty effective thing to have as a weapon, but I can see why Heisenberg only made one of these things. Probably fed up of having to clean up all the friggin' mess it makes. It's as mad as a box of frogs, and it's sure to bring down half the factory just to try and give you a hug. But you'll eventually be pitted against Sturm, where he'll continue to wreck the place and cause as much carnage as physically possible, like giving a 6-year-old a remote control bulldozer. The more walls he busts into, then the more space you've got to move around. So I guess this fight does get a little bit easier the longer it goes on. And you've basically just got to keep shooting the red vent on his back whenever the clumsy bugger bounces off an unbreakable surface, temporarily leaving him vulnerable with that weak spot just asking to be shot to pieces. This will eventually cause his engine to catch fire, allowing Sturm to somehow use that fire to turn himself into a walking flamethrower. So aside from a bunch of chainsaws whizzing around, you've also got to avoid being barbecued alive too. But so long as you keep shooting away at that back vent, it shouldn't take too much more effort to turn him into a fiery pile of scrap. The mastermind behind all those cyberpunk nasties wandering around the underground factory is basically this guy, Steampunk Johnny Depp. So Karl Heisenberg's the fourth and final lord of the village, though unlike the other lords, he prefers to play by his own rules, sort of being the rebel of the pack who actually despises Mother Miranda and secretly plans to overthrow her. This is the reason why he's got a factory pumping out cyborg soldiers, and the reason why he's so adamant on designing the ultimate killing machine, to increase his chances of success when he finally chooses to revolt. Problem is, he also plans to use Ethan's daughter Rose and her mole powers to aid in his little rebellion, something Ethan's not particularly happy about, therefore making him a natural enemy despite them both having some similar motives. But just like pretty much all the other lords, Miranda's implanted this guy with a Cadou parasite too, and instead of twisting him into a Lycan, or a fish man, it basically turned him into Magneto, electrifying his organs, allowing him to manipulate electromagnetic fields, and basically letting him move metal objects around in the air and do all sorts of crazy tricks with them. Because Ethan's not a member of the Avengers, he's not exactly got the power to match Heisenberg in a fight. Good job he manages to find a bloody tank then, isn't it? Turns out that Heisenberg's left one of his toys lying around known as the self-propelled artillery, or the SPA. Okay, probably not the coolest name in the world considering it's got a chainsaw lance and a freaking cannon strapped to its side, though it should at least help us in the epic battle soon to follow. Just gotta wait for this elevator. time now. Of course, Heisenberg's waiting for us at the top, and he's mutated into a big pile of meaty scrap metal. Why wouldn't he? Practically turning into a transformer that can throw metal chunks all over the place. It's basically like a massive BattleBots fight on crack, with Heisenberg rushing forwards with his buzzsaw arms dancing around, all while using the big metal plates dotted around the arena to act as both shields and projectiles. Thankfully, he's kind enough to show us where his weak points are though, by shining bright red lights on them. And so it's probably best to keep peppering them with gunfire until his vulnerable parts start to weaken. But when you think you're about to take him down, he's going to pick you up and smash your little tank to pieces, putting you in a very crappy position, now left to fight for your life and run away from the monster on foot. Those weak spots might be gone now, but a lot of his armour plating's also gone too, revealing the squishy flesh underneath. The good old nade launcher should help to even things up here, and in one final effort to finish you off, he's going to stir up one hell of a storm by generating a metal hurricane, which for some wacky reason also manages to pick you and the partially destroyed tank up, and conveniently place you into the driver's seat of said tank in mid-air. One more blast to the big nasty monster, and it's lights out for Mr. Heisenberg. Might be a bit of an over-the-top fight, but it definitely wasn't boring. As you get closer towards the end of the game and jump into the shoes of Chris Redfield, you'll find a strange monster surrounded by mould vines guarding the entrance that you need to pass through. Remember Urias from earlier on in the game? You know, the big hairy dude with the hammer? Well, this is his older brother, Urias Strajer. Generally a stronger, beastier, more mutated version of the other guy, with the Cadou parasite causing tendrils to flow out from the top of his back. You've probably also noticed that this dude's clutching onto a ridiculously huge mace, and it's probably no surprise what he intends to do with that mace, being very determined to lamp you over the head with it. Getting stuck in a 1v1 fight with this thing in such a hilariously small arena doesn't exactly make this a very comfortable situation to be in, but rest assured Chris Redfield's been in worse situations, and at least he's got access to all that fancy military tech to back him up. Urias Strajer might be more aggressive than his brother, but swinging that mace around is about as inventive as he gets regarding his attacks. Plus he's also got that parasitic weak spot to give you a nice fleshy target to try and shred up with your assault rifle. It's going to be a pretty long slog with this guy soaking up bullets like they're nothing, so you might want to pull out your target locator to light the bugger up with an airstrike while he's stunned. Trust me, you're going to be there all day if you don't. Anyway, it's time to meet Resident Evil Village's final boss. It's kind of obvious who this is going to be throughout most of the game, but I should probably stick a spoiler warning up here anyway, especially with it involving the events surrounding the game's ending. It's been known from fairly early on in the game that a woman known as Mother Miranda is the root cause of all the village's problems. Quite literally. She's created a weird cult, exploited the village and its inhabitants, manipulated the four lords of the region, and filled the place with savage monsters by experimenting with a custom-made parasitic entity. So yeah, she's responsible for doing quite a lot of evil shit. But who the hell is she, and why the hell has she become such a wicked villain? It's a pretty crazy story, but she's actually a biologist born a very long time ago in the late 1800s. She had a little girl called Eva, who was unfortunately killed by the Spanish flu in the year of 1919. And although Miranda survived the pandemic, she was devastated by the loss of her daughter, and pretty much lost the will to live. She wandered into a cave system with no intent on coming back out, but she stumbled into something very bizarre down there, a ginormous fungal root called the megamycete, the source of all the mold and its immense power. This weird baby-shaped thing had been down there for hundreds of years, consuming lots and lots of people over time, including all the dead bodies buried in the surrounding graveyards. And after touching this ancient root, Miranda could see the memories of all the people it had consumed, including the memories of her 10-year-old daughter Eva. Now infected with the mold, Miranda believed that the same substance could be used to bring her daughter's consciousness back from the grave, and by using her newly acquired mold powers, she tricked the nearby villagers into thinking she was some sort of prophet, who would later become test subjects in her underground labs, where she carried out research on the mold in an effort to find someone that could act as a vessel for her daughter's mind. Before we start to feel sympathetic for Miranda, you've got to remember that she's literally playing God and dooming an entire region, and potentially the world, all for the sake of her own selfish idea that might not even bloody work. Many years passed, many villagers got likened, though fast forward to present day and Miranda finally thought she'd found a potential host for Eva's consciousness, in the form of Ethan and Mia's baby daughter Rose. Hence why Ethan gets involved in the village after Rose suddenly gets kidnapped. We've seen how the mold uses DNA to copy other living things, basically letting some infected individuals shapeshift, and Miranda's got quite a few mouldy disguises to help keep her hidden in plain sight. She's been using pretty much everyone for her own personal gain, so it only makes sense for her to use Ethan too. manipulating him to take out the 4 lords so they don't pose any problems for Miranda further down the line. And as soon as the 4th and final lord gets vanquished, well, it's time for Miranda to pop out to take care of Ethan too, with him no longer being any use to her. With the Megamycete awoken, practically destroying the village as it erupts from the ground, Miranda runs off back to the ritual site to execute her plan once and for all. But of course, Ethan's still able to get back up despite having his friggin' heart ripped out. He technically died at the start of the last game at the hands of Jack Baker, only to be resurrected by the mold, fusing with his DNA, which sort of explains why he can just casually shove his limbs back on. He might not exactly be human, but I guess being a mold man does have its benefits, allowing Ethan to rise up again to catch up with Miranda at the ritual site, where she's now completely surrounded by the Megamycete. So onto the actual boss fight itself. Being a shape-shifting mold witch, you can expect Miranda to use a lot of weird moldy attacks against you, not only being able to generate her own weapons and throwable projectiles, but also completely change her physical form to switch between different attack styles, basically to spice things up so the fight doesn't get too boring. Having control of all the mold in the room, you can expect her to use the environment to her advantage quite a lot, generating waves of black goop to come shooting out from the floor, creating fungal root barriers to act as obstacles, and of course, causing these crazy yellow blobs to appear to create some absolute chaos. There's a hell of a lot of stuff to keep an eye on here, alternating between the normal demonic witch to a huge fungal spider monster, which dive bombs you from across the room and pounces from higher vantage points. If she gets bored of jumping on your head, she can always turn into her Angel of Death form, where she'll grow a bunch of back wings and persistently swoop down from the air like a pissed off crow trying to scare away a cat. Miranda might have lost her regenerative abilities, but she's still going to take a truckload of bullets and bombs to finally bring down. And just like always, aiming for the head's going to be a good idea, if you don't want this fight to go on for longer than it needs to. And once the wicked bitch is dead, she'll calcify like they always do, allowing Rose to be collected from the remnants of her body. Ethan's in a bit of a messed up state, and chooses to sacrifice himself to take down the rampaging Megamycete, leaving himself behind to blow the big fungus fetus skywards, while Chris Redfield hops on his helicopter to whisk Rose and Mia off to safety, far, far away from this bloody awful village. So that might be the end of this video, but if you want to see loads of other Resident Evil monsters from other games, then you should probably check out the playlist up on the screen right now. Big shout out to all my channel members for the support, and a big thanks for sticking around till the end.